Greg, my boss, smirked and said, "You're already overpaid," when I asked for a $12,000 raise. His words cut deeper than he knew, because behind every late-night fix, every silent rescue at 2 in the morning, was me. I carried the company on my back, yet he laughed as if my worth was a joke. That night, I watched my son sleep through the crack of his bedroom door and wondered if he'd ever know why his father kept missing birthdays. What Greg didn't know was that I had been keeping records. Every save, every stolen credit. And one day, they'd all matter. Greg's laugh still echoed in my head as I walked into the fluorescent-lit office the next morning. I forced myself to focus, burying the sting beneath the rituals of routine, booting up my terminal, checking the overnight alerts, scanning the incident dashboard for red spikes. 10 years I had carried this system. 10 years of late-night patches and emergency saves. And yet my worth had been reduced to a joke in front of the people I worked hardest for. I told myself that silence was sometimes the sharpest blade. I had grown accustomed to being the company's quiet firefighter. When deployments went bad at 1 in the morning, it was me they called. When a product demo was minutes from collapse, I patched it without asking who would take the credit. My reward was the strange anonymity of being essential but invisible. I didn't resent it, at least not at first. I thought integrity would always speak for itself, but integrity, I was beginning to learn, often spoke too softly to be heard over arrogance. The previous night had been no different. A cascading failure had threatened to bring down our entire client portal. I had rolled back a configuration, documented the root cause, and written a step-by-step recovery plan. By the time the graph steadied, it was 2:17 a.m. I logged off, exhausted, and drove home through empty streets. When I opened the door, the house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. My son's bedroom light was still on, but when I peeked inside, he was already asleep at his desk, his head resting on his open math book. I lifted him gently, carried him to bed, and turned off the light. Emily was waiting in the living room. She didn't raise her voice. She never did. "You're losing us, Nathan," she said softly. "One day, he'll stop waiting for you. And when that happens, no salary in the world will buy you back into his childhood." I nodded, because what else could I do? I told her I was doing this for us, for him. But even to my own ears, the words sounded rehearsed. The following day, while digging through performance logs, I stumbled upon something disturbing. A silent vulnerability in the system architecture that no one else seemed to have noticed. If exploited, it could cascade into financial losses our company couldn't withstand. I should have escalated it immediately. Instead, I convinced myself I could handle it alone. Maybe I didn't trust anyone else. Maybe I wanted to prove, even if only to myself, that I was still indispensable. Either way, I tucked it into my private notes, telling myself I'd patch it over the weekend. What I didn't realize was that my decision had set a trap, a double-edged knife that would later be turned against me. That afternoon, the leadership called for an all-hands meeting. We packed into the glass conference room, laptops open, coffee cups sweating on the table. As the team shuffled papers, I noticed a new face leaning casually in the corner. Greg Saunders, my newly promoted direct manager. His reputation had preceded him. Ambitious, sharp-tongued, eager to rise quickly. When I began outlining the overnight fix and the potential vulnerability I had quietly contained, he smirked as if he were humoring a child. "So you're the one who keeps the lights on," he said loud enough for the room to hear. Funny, I thought the system ran itself. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough. My jaw tightened. That was my introduction to Greg. The meeting ended, but the smirk stayed with me. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the contempt behind them. In that moment, I knew Greg didn't see me as a colleague. To him, I was a stepping stone. He wasn't here to build with us. He was here to climb, and people like me were just rungs on his ladder. I walked back to my desk. My hands clenched into fists in my pockets and opened my email. A new thread had appeared, Quarterly Innovation Report. My eyes froze on the screen. Slides from my design notes, my diagrams, my bullet points were repackaged under Greg's name. Not even a passing mention of me. It was as if I didn't exist. My heart sank, not from the theft itself, but from the realization that the game had already begun. That evening, my phone buzzed. It was my mother. Her voice was kind but heavy with unspoken disappointment. "Nathan," she said, "why are you still just an engineer? All your friends from college are directors, VPs. You've given your whole life to this company, and what has it given you back?" I swallowed hard, unable to answer. She didn't know about the 2 a.m. saves, the weekends lost, the missed birthdays. She didn't know that inside these walls, credit wasn't given, it was stolen. At the office, colleagues began to distance themselves. People who once lingered by my desk now avoided eye contact. A junior developer who used to shadow me at incident reviews suddenly sat 2 rows away. Fear was contagious, and no one wanted to be caught standing too close to a man already marked. Then came the birthday. My son's 10th. I had promised that I would be home by 6. I even bought a cake and left it in the break room fridge, ready to bring home. But at 5:45, Greg summoned me into another urgent meeting. By the time I returned to my desk, it was past 7. I drove home in silence, the cake box heavy on the seat beside me. When I walked through the door, I saw the remains of candles dripping wax on the table. My son stood in the hallway, his face streaked with tears. "You always say you'll come, but you never do," he whispered before running to his room. The sting of Greg's insult was nothing compared to that. Later that week, as I walked past the glass wall of the executive suite, I caught a fragment of conversation. It was Victoria Lane, the VP, speaking sharply into her phone. "We'll push him out before vesting. I don't care how. Just make sure he's gone." My chest tightened. For a moment I stood frozen, replaying her words. Push him out. Before vesting. I walked back to my desk, my mind racing. They weren't just ignoring me anymore. They were planning my removal. And I had just realized the storm was no longer coming. It was already here. The words from Victoria's phone call replayed in my head for days. Push him out before vesting. At first, I tried to dismiss it, convincing myself I had misheard. But the signs piled up too neatly to ignore. Invitations to critical meetings no longer reached my calendar. Documents I authored appeared in executive folders with Greg's name in bold. And when I raised concerns about resource allocation, Greg's response was a thin smile and a shake of his head, as if I were a child pestering him with nonsense. One morning, an official report landed in my inbox. The title read, Operational Root Cause Analysis. I opened it and froze. It was my work, my notes, my log entries, my diagrams, but heavily edited. The vulnerability I had discovered was reframed as team negligence. The implication was clear. The fault lay with me. At the bottom, a space waited for my signature. Signing would mean admitting guilt. Refusing would mean isolation, perhaps termination. The document was a cage, and they expected me to lock the door myself. I stared at the screen and felt a surge of anger so sharp I nearly hurled the laptop across the room. That was when it clicked. Greg wasn't clever enough to orchestrate this. His ambition was obvious. His insults clumsy. He was a pawn, a front man. The real strategist was Victoria. She pulled the strings from behind the polished walls of her office, letting Greg take the credit and the heat while she tightened the noose. That evening, Emily noticed my silence at dinner. The table was set. My son chattered about a school project, but I barely touched my food. After our son went to bed, she sat beside me on the couch. "Nathan," she said quietly, "what's happening at work? You've been somewhere else for weeks." I wanted to tell her everything, the reports, the theft, the plan to push me out, but the words stuck. How could I explain the humiliation of being erased? Instead, I just said, "It's complicated. I'll handle it." She touched my hand, her eyes searching mine. "Don't let them take the best parts of you," she whispered. I wished I could believe her. The next morning, Greg cornered me by the break room. "About that report," he said smoothly, "sign it, and we can all move forward. No one has to get hurt." His tone carried the weight of an order dressed as advice. I looked him in the eye and asked, "And if I don't?" He smirked. "Then you're alone." His words weren't a threat. They were a promise. I opened the report again later that day, hovering over the signature line. The dilemma burned through me: lie to keep my job, or stand by the truth and let them isolate me. I'll ask you, if it were you, would you sign away your integrity just to keep the paycheck? Would you bow to the system or take the fall for something you didn't do? That night, I bought a leather-bound notebook and began to write. Dates, times, incidents, fixes, who said what, who took credit, who looked away. It wasn't a manifesto, just facts. Facts that couldn't be twisted so easily if they were recorded in my own hand. With every entry, I felt the faint stirrings of control returning. I had no power to change their lies, but I could keep the truth. My secret weapon wasn't sabotage or revenge. It was evidence. The war was no longer about fixing systems. It was about survival. In the weeks that followed, I grew meticulous. Every email that hinted at misconduct, I archived. Every meeting that smelled of manipulation, I transcribed afterward. And slowly, a picture emerged. This wasn't just me. They had done it to others. Careers cut short, credit laundered, reputations crushed. One afternoon, while sifting through logs, I noticed a pattern of comments from a junior engineer named Lena. Her work was sharp, precise, and yet in the project reports, her name never appeared. I reached out quietly. She hesitated, then admitted she had been writing modules for months, only to see them handed off to more visible engineers. "It doesn't matter what I do," she said, eyes downcast. "They'll never let me be more than invisible." I saw myself in her words. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. Around that time, my mother fell ill. The hospital bills stacked higher than I could manage. I went to Greg, swallowing my pride, and asked for an advance. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, and smirked. "You should learn to play the game, Nathan. Maybe then you wouldn't need handouts." His refusal stung, but it was his tone, the sheer cruelty of it, that seared into me. I walked out of his office with my fists clenched. But when I reached my mother's bedside later, her frail smile undid me. "Son," she whispered, "don't let them steal your dignity. Money can come and go, but dignity, once lost, is gone forever." Her words steadied me more than any paycheck ever could. At home, I found solace in small rituals, reading to my son before bed, sitting beside Emily in the quiet after midnight. These moments were my pauses, my reminders that life existed beyond the poison walls of the office. They were the reason I couldn't give in. But Victoria was sharp. She sensed resistance. Subtle changes crept into my days. Random check-ins, sudden questions about my projects, whispers that I was keeping something hidden. It was clear she had sent people to watch me. The air grew heavy with suspicion. Every glance in the hallway, a possible report back to her. What they didn't know was that I was hiding something. Not a weapon to destroy them, but a record that would outlast their lies. And as I closed my notebook one night, the weight of her gaze lingering in my imagination, I realized something chilling. She was right to be suspicious, because the day would come when the truth I was gathering would be impossible to ignore. The summons arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, a terse calendar invite titled Formal Review. Hearing appeared in my inbox, with Victoria, Greg, and 2 HR directors listed as attendees. My gut tightened. They weren't waiting any longer. They were ready to end me. The conference room was colder than usual, the kind of sterile chill designed to make you uncomfortable. Victoria sat at the head of the table, her expression carved from stone. Greg lounged to her right, the smug satisfaction of a man who thought the finish line was in sight. Across the table lay a stack of printed documents. One of the HR directors slid them toward me. "Mr. Harlow," Victoria began smoothly, "our investigation shows you have withheld critical knowledge, failed to document procedures properly, and, in some cases, sabotaged system resilience. These are serious violations." Her words struck like hammer blows. Sabotage. That was the charge. To the untrained ear, it sounded damning. To me, it was absurd. I had done the opposite. Documented, safeguarded, trained. Yet here they were, twisting diligence into deceit. I flipped through the documents. They were carefully assembled, screenshots missing context, emails stripped of threads, cherry-picked lines from my notes. It was a masterclass in framing a man. At the bottom of the last page was a space for my signature, an admission of guilt. "Sign this," Greg said lightly, "and we'll move forward without escalation. Otherwise—" He let the word hang, savoring it. I looked up, my chest burning with fury. 10 years of service reduced to this moment. But before I could speak, a voice came from the doorway. "That's not true." It was Lena. Her hands shook as she clutched a folder to her chest, but her voice carried. "Nathan trained me. He documented everything. I have the session notes, the recordings, the shared drives. He never hid knowledge. He shared it, more than anyone here." The room fell into stunned silence. Victoria's face didn't change, but her eyes flicked sharply toward Greg. He shifted in his chair, suddenly less comfortable. One HR director cleared her throat. "Ms. Lane, do you have proof of these claims?" Lena nodded and stepped forward, laying out files, timestamps, training logs, collaborative documents, evidence not of sabotage, but of mentorship. My throat tightened as I watched. For weeks I had felt invisible, erased, and now here was someone, at risk to herself, choosing to stand beside me. Victoria leaned back, her expression unreadable. "Regardless," she said, The perception of gatekeeping remains. Mr. Harlow, if you admit partial responsibility, we can resolve this quietly. If you refuse, consequences will follow. It was the dilemma I had feared: accept a false guilt to preserve some semblance of stability, or refuse and face exile. I thought of Emily, of the mounting bills, of the house payments. I thought of my son, of the way his eyes had filled with tears on his birthday. His words echoed in my head, "Dad, just do the right thing." I set the papers down carefully. "I won't sign lies," I said. My voice was steady, though my heart pounded. "If you want me gone, do it honestly. Don't ask me to bury the truth for you." Greg sneered. "You're replaceable, Nathan. You're just another cog." But I smiled, a small, quiet smile, because I knew something they didn't. My notebook was full, my evidence airtight. And beyond this room, doors were already opening. I rose, gathered my things, and walked out without another word. That night, as if the universe itself had been waiting, the offer came through. A rival company I had spoken with weeks earlier finalized their proposal: $280,000 total compensation, a role designed around the very skills Victoria had mocked. Reading the email, my chest loosened for the first time in months. It wasn't just a lifeline. It was proof that my value was real. I drafted my resignation letter and slid it into HR's inbox the next morning. The reaction was immediate. Greg stormed into my office, his face pale. "You can't leave," he said, his voice breaking. "Name your price?" His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by desperation. I didn't answer. I simply handed him my badge. But resignation was only part of it. That evening, I opened my files and compiled a packet of evidence: emails, logs, meeting transcripts, Lena's corroboration. I sent it, not to the press, but to the board's audit committee. Facts, nothing more. Let them decide whether Victoria's empire was built on sand. When I got home, Emily and my son were waiting. I pulled them both into my arms. "From now on," I whispered, "I'll be here. I won't miss the things that matter." My son smiled into my chest, and for the first time in years, I felt whole. The following week, whispers spread. An anonymous tip had reached journalists. Reports of internal misconduct, credit theft, and systemic silencing surfaced. Victoria's name was mentioned, though not yet confirmed. Investors started asking questions. I watched from a distance as the cracks widened. Victoria was rattled, though she masked it well. For a woman who thrived on control, chaos was the one thing she couldn't contain. And as the headlines multiplied, I closed my notebook, knowing the story was no longer mine alone. The truth was finally escaping the walls that had tried to bury it. The first headline appeared on a Monday morning, plastered across an industry blog. Inside, the culture of credit theft at TechCore. I nearly dropped my coffee as I scrolled. It was all there. Accounts of late-night fixes credited to managers, employees silenced, performance reviews manipulated to justify promotions for the undeserving. My name wasn't in print, but I recognized the fingerprints of my notes and Lena's evidence woven through the story. For years, the truth had been invisible. Now, it screamed from the front page. By noon, the article was trending. Investors panicked. Clients demanded reassurances. And inside the company, whispers turned to open suspicion. "If they did it to him," people began to murmur, "who's next?" Victoria held an emergency town hall, her voice crisp and dismissive. "These are baseless rumors," she said, brushing off every pointed question. But the cracks were showing in her polished facade. Then came the twist I hadn't expected. a second report surfaced. This one from a completely different source. It contained emails and screenshots I had never seen before, details of budget manipulations, contracts rerouted to favored vendors, even notes hinting at pressure from higher up to bury system vulnerabilities. Whoever this second whistleblower was, they had access to things far beyond my reach. Suddenly, it wasn't just my fight anymore. The fire had spread. Stock prices dipped by the end of the week. By Friday, they had plunged. Entire teams began questioning leadership decisions. Slack channels buzzed with employees speculating about who might be next to resign. For the first time, the company's myth of invincibility was crumbling, not from external competition, but from within. At home, I tried to breathe. The chaos outside was intoxicating, but it also scared me. I didn't want to be consumed by it. That evening, I sat with my son at the kitchen table, helping him with his science project. He looked up and asked, "Dad, why are people talking about your old company on TV?" I hesitated, then said, "Because sometimes, when people do wrong things, it takes a while for the truth to come out. Doing the right thing isn't about winning right away. It's about waiting long enough for the right to matter." His brow furrowed in thought. Then he smiled. "Like planting a tree," he said. I laughed softly, exactly like that. But the calm didn't last. By the following Monday, government regulators announced they were opening a formal inquiry. The words "official investigation" appeared in every news feed. For the first time, Victoria looked rattled. I saw a clip of her leaving the building, cameras flashing as she pushed past reporters. Greg was nowhere to be seen. Inside the company, silence grew heavier than noise. Leadership released carefully worded statements, but employees had stopped believing. Rumors of mass resignations swirled. A culture once built on fear now tasted its own medicine: paranoia. Everyone was looking over their shoulder. Greg's fall came first. In a leaked memo, he was stripped of his role and reassigned to special projects, a corporate exile. The man who once sneered at me in meetings had become a scapegoat. I should have felt vindicated, but instead, I felt only emptiness. Watching someone drown in the same sea they once shoved me into wasn't sweet. It was just inevitable. Victoria, however, was still standing, her grip on power tenuous but intact. That changed when the investigation broadened. Regulators announced evidence suggesting not just isolated misconduct, but systemic corruption spanning multiple firms, all tied to the same vendor network. This was bigger than one company. It was a web, and Victoria was tangled at its center. I began seeing familiar faces in unfamiliar places. One afternoon, while grocery shopping, I spotted a former colleague by the produce aisle. He caught sight of me, froze, and turned away. Shame or fear, I couldn't tell. For a moment, I wondered if they blamed me, if exposing the truth had cost them stability they weren't ready to lose. The thought weighed heavier than I expected. I reminded myself that silence would have cost even more. That night, Emily set down her glass of wine and looked at me. "You know this isn't over, right? People like Victoria don't go quietly." I nodded. She was right. For every headline, there was a counter-move being plotted. The difference now was that I wasn't the only one keeping records. A week later, near dusk, a car pulled up outside our house. I saw the silhouette through the curtains, broad shoulders, a familiar gait. When the doorbell rang, my stomach dropped. Standing on my porch, dressed in a rumpled suit and looking far older than his years, was Greg. His expression wasn't smug this time. It was desperate. "Can we talk?" he asked. And just like that, the storm I thought I had escaped was standing at my door. Greg stood in my doorway, like a man who had forgotten how to breathe. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes hollow. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "Nathan, I need to explain." Emily appeared behind me, tense, her arm instinctively reaching for our son. "You don't owe him anything," she whispered. I nodded, but I stepped outside anyway, closing the door gently behind me. If Greg had come this far, it wasn't just to spit another insult. He leaned against the porch railing, trembling. "I was never the one pulling the strings," he admitted. "Victoria used me. She used all of us. I thought I was climbing, but I was only moving where she allowed." His words carried no arrogance now, only a pitiful honesty that felt almost foreign on his tongue. I folded my arms, waiting. He swallowed hard and lowered his voice. "It's not just her. There's a network, an organized circle of executives that crosses companies. They bury mistakes, protect each other, trade power like currency. Victoria is only one of their hands. The real body. You can't imagine how deep it goes." The revelation sent a cold shiver down my spine. I had suspected corruption, but this was larger, darker than I had dared to guess. It wasn't only about stolen credit or one man's humiliation. It was an ecosystem, a system designed to feed on people like me until we broke. Behind the front door, I heard a faint shuffle. Emily had guided our son upstairs, her voice low and soothing. For a moment, I let myself breathe in the image of them safe, warm, untouched by the poison outside. That was my pause, my anchor. Then I turned back to Greg. He pulled a folder from his briefcase, the paper frayed at the corners. "This," he said, pressing it into my hands, "is everything I could copy before they cut me out. Financial irregularities, off-the-record agreements, communications that prove Victoria isn't working alone." His hands shook as he let go. "If you expose this, you'll be a target. But if you don't, they'll keep running the world like it belongs to them." I stared at the folder, its weight heavier than it looked. "Why me?" I asked quietly. Greg gave a bitter laugh. "Because you're the only one who stood up when everyone else signed the lie. And because you already lit the fire." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, shoulders hunched, a man already defeated. I carried the folder inside, placed it on the kitchen table, and sat staring at it until long after the house had gone quiet. Days later, as I sifted through the documents, the truth unfolded like a rotten tapestry. Shell companies, slush funds, chains of emails that implicated not just Victoria, but names I recognized from other firms, even regulatory boards. The scale was suffocating. For every file I read, 10 more questions bloomed. But I wasn't alone anymore. Lena reached out discreetly, offering to connect me with others who had seen behind the curtain. One by one, voices emerged. Engineers, managers, even a mid-level director, people who had quietly gathered receipts, waiting for someone to tie them together. It hit me then. The secret weapon wasn't just my notebook. It was us. A network of people too stubborn to stay silent. Still, doubt gnawed at me. With power this entrenched, could we really make a difference? One evening, I visited my mother in the hospital. Her health had declined, but her mind was sharp. I sat beside her bed, the folder in my lap. "Mom," I said softly, "I don't know if I can take this fight further. What if it destroys us?" She reached for my hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nathan, you've already done more than most. You refuse to let them break you. You've done what your father never dared." Her eyes glistened. "Don't stop now. The truth may be heavy, but it's lighter than a lifetime of silence." Her words burned into me, carving away the last of my hesitation. I left her room with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Back home, I spread the evidence across the dining table, arranging it like puzzle pieces. Patterns emerged, lines of corruption connecting names across industries, beyond Victoria, beyond Greg. And with each connection, the picture became less about one company and more about a culture that had devoured countless lives. Yet even as the network of truth formed, so did the weight of choice. If I released everything, innocent people, those who had looked away out of fear rather than malice, might be ruined alongside the guilty. If I held back, the system might survive long enough to regroup. I stood at the window, the city lights flickering in the distance, the folder heavy in my hands. The voices of my allies echoed in my head, but so did the image of my son, asleep upstairs, dreaming in safety I had fought to preserve. The choice was no longer just mine. It was a crossroad that could change an entire industry or destroy it. The decision weighed on me like lead, but once made, it set me free. I did not leak everything. I curated what mattered most, evidence that revealed the architecture of corruption while sparing those who had been caught in its gears against their will. The board could not ignore the truth. Regulators expanded their probe, and Victoria's empire began to collapse under its own weight. By the time I started at my new job, the air felt lighter. The company was young, built by former employees who had also fled the shadows of Victoria's domain. I was surprised when I recognized some faces from old corridors, people I thought had given up. "We wanted to build something different," one of the founders told me, "a place where credit belongs to those who earn it." In my first weeks there, I noticed the difference immediately. Meetings weren't performances, they were conversations. Success wasn't claimed by a single voice, but celebrated across the team. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't invisible. I wasn't a cog, or a scapegoat, or a shield. I was simply Nathan, and that was enough. One crisp morning, I walked my son to school. The sun lit the street in soft gold as we strolled hand in hand. He chattered about dinosaurs, about building a volcano for science class, about how he wanted to be an inventor like Dad. When we reached the gate, he hugged me tightly and said, "You're on time today." His words pierced me, not with pain, but with a quiet joy I hadn't felt in years. That moment, being present, truly present, was worth more than every raise denied, every late-night fix unrecognized. Back at my desk later that day, my phone buzzed. A message appeared from an unfamiliar number. "We've heard what you did. We need help. Our company is facing the same kind of injustice. Will you guide us?" I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. The fight wasn't over. It was spreading. Justice had ripple effects, and people were looking for someone to stand beside them. I didn't answer immediately, but the seed was planted. Meanwhile, the news cycle kept turning. My old company staggered under the weight of investigations. Victoria vanished from industry circles, retreating into obscurity. Rumors whispered that she had been barred from boardrooms, her name a liability no one wanted attached. Greg, on the other hand, reappeared in a surprising way. Months after his desperate visit to my porch, I read an article about a volunteer program teaching underprivileged kids how to code. There was a photo. Greg, sleeves rolled up, kneeling beside a child pointing at a computer screen. His smile was weary, but genuine. Perhaps even those who fell hardest could find a way to rebuild. As for me, I couldn't let the lesson end with my own escape. With Emily's encouragement, I founded a small fund, a resource for workers who faced retaliation when standing up for fairness. We called it the Ledger Project because keeping receipts had saved me, and I wanted others to have the same chance. Applications came slowly at first, then steadily. Stories echoing my own in ways both painful and familiar. Each time we could help, I felt a measure of peace. On my son's 11th birthday, I was there from the first candle lit to the last slice of cake eaten. I watched him blow out the candles, cheeks puffed, eyes shining, and when he made his wish, he looked at me before grinning. Emily slipped her hand into mine. "He sees you now," she whispered. I nodded, feeling tears sting my eyes. Later that night, I checked on him as he slept. The room was filled with the quiet rhythm of his breathing, the soft glow of the nightlight painting the walls. I sat beside his bed and brushed his hair back gently. The world outside still spun with greed, ambition, and betrayal. But here in this room was the truth I had fought for. "Son," I whispered, my voice trembling. I kept my promise.